Topic is word studies. So I've called this Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic smorgasbord. If you've ever been to a Scandinavian smorgasbord, you'll know why I picked that word, because lots of variety and you can kind of pick what you like. The subtitle is "The Diamonds Are in the Details," specifically of the original text. When you look at and read a good English translation of the Bible, you are getting the same information as if you were reading the Greek New Testament or the Hebrew Old Testament. However, there are a few details that are in the original text that don't necessarily come in quite as easy to see in English translation. And so for the next few hours, we'll be looking at examples of that. Let me start with the first verse of the Bible. The first verse of the Bible: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Or in Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And there's actually a little more detail in the Hebrew text than is immediately apparent in the English translation of that. So, for instance, what do we learn about the identity of the Creator of the heavens and the earth from the very first verse in the Bible? One of the things that we learn from Genesis 1:1 is that the Creator has a plural identity. And we learn that because the subject noun is Elohim, which is a regular masculine plural noun in the Hebrew language. And yet, when we look at the action verb of that same sentence, verse 1, the action verb is a singular. So the subject noun is a plural, and yet the action verb that goes with that subject noun is a singular. And so immediately that presents a puzzle to the casual reading of this verse, because we are introduced on the first sentence of the Bible to this Creator who is both plural and singular at the same time. Plural and one at the same time. And we see that in the Hebrew text of it. So bara is a singular verb. Verbs in Hebrew are either designating completed action or not completed action, which usually means continuing, or it could mean future. But if an action is completed, then it's a perfect verb. And if it's not completed, then it's most likely going to be an imperfect verb, or it could be a participle. But which is it in Genesis 1:1? Is the action of creating that is referred to in that sentence an action that is completed, or is still being still being active? That is, it's still continuing. And it is a perfect verb. So that means the action of creating that is referred to in Genesis 1:1 is a completed action. Another thing that we can notice from a Hebrew verb is whether the action that's taking place is active, passive, or both. And that's a hithbael, but a hithbael is not what we're dealing with here. In this case, bara, the action verb of Genesis 1:1, is active. So the Creator, who is named as Elohim, he actively created the universe. So the universe did not create itself. And then we also can look at a Hebrew verb to see if the action is being reported as simple action, intensive action, or action that is caused. And which is it in Genesis 1:1? The action that is described in that sentence, is it action that the Creator intensively did? Or is it action that he caused? That is, he set it in motion. Maybe invented some processes that if you hit enough dominoes, they eventually produce a result. No, neither of those is the case. The action verb in Genesis 1:1 is a simple action. In other words, creating the entire heavens and the earth to God was simple. That's interesting to think about. The heavens and the earth are created things that we will never exhaust our understanding of. And yet, to God, it was simple to make all that. Well, that's because He's God. In fact, if we read further in the Scriptures, we see that of the Trinity, the one most directly involved in creating the universe is God the Son, Christ. And we see that in John 1:3, John 1:10 through 14, Hebrews 1:1 through 12, and Colossians 1:14 through 17. And you may notice that Adam is feeling his side in that picture. There's something about his ribs that feels different when he woke up and was introduced to his wife. It's an amazing thing that God has not only made the universe that He's made, but that He has chosen to make us in His image so that we can understand Him and what He does in a way that is beyond what any other creature can. David said, "When I consider Thy heavens, the work of Thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which Thou hast ordained, what is man that You are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that Thou dost visit him?" How did we end up with this great privilege that we have of being created in God's image and being given the opportunity to study His creation and to learn about Him in the process? My wife can tell you that there was a chance I would not be created a human. I almost got created what? A grackle. God could have made me a grackle. You know, you go to these grocery store parking lots and you see all these blackbirds on the power lines gathering about. A lot of them are grackles. They have big tails. And one day I was looking at a pond, looking to see what kind of birds were congregating around the cattails, and I saw a grackle. And that this scary realization came to me, and that was, that could have been me. I could have been that grackle, and I couldn't have done a thing about it. Couldn't have stopped it. It happened to that grackle. It could have happened to me. And each of us in this room, or whoever watches this, the recorded version of this, you think about that. God could have made you a grackle, and if He did, there's not a thing you could have done to stop it. But He chose to make us humans, and not just any old humans, but the very specific, unique humans that each one of us is. What is man that Thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that Thou visit him? David was amazed at the God who made the heavens and the earth, that God had chosen to personally contact him and have a personal relationship with him. And we should be amazed as well. In fact, because we have the New Testament, we should be more amazed than David was. Well, in the second verse of Genesis, we see a detail that's pretty important and has become the basis of at least some controversy. That verse includes the phrase, "and the earth was without form and void." Now that's Genesis 1:2. The earth was without form and void. And to those who advocate the gap theory or ruin and reconstruction theory, they have looked to that verse in hopes that that verse buttresses their theory about Earth's origins. And many in that group have suggested the idea that Genesis 1:2 should be translated, "and the earth became without form and void," instead of "it was without form and void." The idea is became would be some kind of a change happened. And of course, with creation being made very good, and then it ends up fallen, there is a change at some point, but not at verse 2. In fact, the word that is translated was in verse 2 should be translated was. It should not be translated became. In fact, that verb is the same verb that God based his name on. So the Hebrew verb is hayah, and that's the normal Hebrew verb for to be. I mean, there is no better way, there is no Hebrew word that better says to be than that verb, hayah. And so God's name, Yahweh, is that verb with a Y stuck on the front, which would indicate not completed action. And that's exactly who God is. He is. He is the one who is and continues to be. And he's never finished being the being that he is. And in Exodus 3:14, he says, I am that I am. You know, what other name can you give him? He is the one, he is the being. And so that verb has the idea of being. So why would God pick a form of hayah, the verb that means to be, as the basis for the noun that his name is, if hayah was a verb that had the idea of change? Anyway, so Genesis 1:2 really does say the earth was without form and void, and not that it somehow became without form and void. And another example to indicate that is Genesis 2:18, where it is mentioned, God told Moses to write down that it was not good that the man, that is Adam, should be alone. Well, if one were to say that hayah means to become, that is to change in some way from what you used to be, then that verse would have the meaning that it became that Adam, it became not good that Adam should be alone. In other words, suggesting that Adam's marital status had somehow changed and now he was single. So does that mean that he got divorced to someone before Eve came along? Or, I mean, you know, it descends into silliness. Genesis 2:18 is indicating that Adam's single status before God made woman, who's renamed Eve later, that his original single status was not a changed condition from something before that, but rather that was the original continuing condition that Adam was created with. And then God made a change by making woman, and then she ends up getting a name change and becomes known as Eve because she is the mother of all living. But that name change doesn't happen until after Genesis 3:15, because there needs to be the promise of the Messiah for that name change to make sense. Anyway, so going back to the previous slide that talked about the gap theory, it's not only Genesis 1:2 that uses hayah, a form of hayah, to indicate that being is what's going on, not becoming. And the same is the case for Adam, that his singleness before God made woman was a continuing condition of being for him from his creation, not a change from what he originally was. Okay, so in other words, there's no divorce in Genesis 1, 2, or 3. And there are other examples of hayah where it's obvious that being is the meaning of that verb, not becoming. Well, that goes back to a very basic truth that we need to always respect, and many people do not. And that is, if you want to know anything meaningful, anything important, anything accurate about our origins, you've got to go to the Bible. There is no substitute, and there is a whole lot about what happened at the beginning that we would never know unless God chose to put it in the Bible. There are many things that we can search all we want, investigate all we want, and we will not find the right answer unless God chooses to give it to us. And so a little bit later in this program, we're going to look at the limitations of empirical science and why empirical science is not a good method for learning the truth about no longer observable, unique events of the past. It's very helpful for looking at things that go on in the present, particularly repeatable things. But it is not a useful or reliable method for learning about the events of the past that are no longer observable, particularly if they are unique as opposed to repeating events. So we definitely need the Scripture to learn about the past, our origins, and the origin of our universe, and the origin of languages, and many other things that had a beginning. And of course, beginnings, by their very nature, beginnings are not repeatable. And I mean, it's even true of us. I mean, each one of us had a birthday. We had a day on which we were born, and physically that doesn't happen a second time. But more on that in a little bit later. In the meantime, we'll think about how God also made the cosmos in an orderly way. And so it makes sense that the nations and the people in the nations that took the Bible very seriously are the same people and the same nations who ended up becoming leaders in what we now call science and mathematics and technology. Because reading the Bible gave those who read it and took it seriously a confidence that the universe is orderly because the universe was made by an orderly God who is logical and who is consistent and is not random or frivolous. And so that's no surprise that we have been able to learn a lot about the cosmos by assuming that the cosmos has the traits and that they are logical and understandable, and that because it has those traits, we can study it, and it's worth studying. You know, if you were to study some very detailed aspect of creation, whether it's something on the earth or something in the heavens, and if you studied it real well, and yet you had this idea that, well, tomorrow when I wake up, all of this may be false, that would demotivate you from wanting to put a whole lot of time and effort into studying whatever it is you're studying, whether it's some kind of plants, some kind of animals, what the planets do, what the stars do. But there are no lucky naturalistic accidents. The universe is not chaotic, and it didn't result from an imaginary Big Bang. God made the cosmos in an orderly way, and as a result, it is worth studying. In fact, as we'll find out tomorrow morning, very systematic, detailed study of God's creation is actually commanded, at least twice in the New Testament. Well, before we leave completely this idea of God creating the heavens, I have a limerick, and the limerick describes the problem of humans who choose not to believe what God has revealed in His Word about how He originated the universe. And when humans close their Bibles and then try to invent what they think is an explanation for how things got here, they end up with ideas that are wrong. So here's the limerick. Deists pegged Earth's years in the millions. Many stretch that today to the billions. Dismissing day 4, God's word they ignore, thus erring by margins of billions. The Bible to read some are able, yet prefer to read a false fable. Though God's word says 6 days, a Big Bang gets their praise. Their doctrine, therefore, is unstable. Psalm 19 talks about how the heavens declare the glory of God. And the first part of that psalm is focused on what God has done in the heavens. But the second part of that psalm, you could say the second half, also talks about how God has revealed himself in his written word. So he has revealed himself as the creator by the creation that he's made. And so we can learn some things about him by looking at his works. But we can also learn other things about him by reading his words and taking them seriously. So the second part of Psalm 19 says, the law of the Lord is perfect, converting, shuving, that is, causing to return the soul. So God made our souls should belong with him, but we've erred. Like sheep, we've gone astray. And what we need is to be redemptively brought back, restored, returned to the Lord. Our souls need to be returned to him. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. When I read this Psalm 19:7, I'm reminded of a time years ago when I was in a room that was watching a screen, and the screen had a video on it, a live video feed, which came to us by satellite. And on the other end of this satellite-based communication was the International Space Station. And Colonel Jeff Williams, one of America's astronauts, was on the space station at that time, and he was communicating to us in the room and allowing us to ask questions, and then he was giving answers. And when it was my turn, I asked him, what do you think of Psalm 19 as you are in space and you're seeing things that other people will never see? And how does that affect you when you read Psalm 19 about the heavens declare the glory of God? And so he talked about that for a little while and said that, I really can't put into words what I see of God's glory out here. And then he said, but there's something else I want to say, but we're coming up on a interruption in the satellite transmission. So in a little bit, we'll reconnect and we'll be communicating by another satellite, and then I'll finish my answer. So in the reconnected communication, Colonel Williams said, but when I read Psalm 19, my favorite part is actually the second half, because it talks about the law of the Lord being perfect, and that it converts our souls. And it's the written word of God that really connects me to God, although his creation is certainly very glorious. So that's something we can all take appreciation of, is that we have the written word of God. We have it in our language. It's convenient. At the present moment, it's not illegal to have a Bible in your possession, and we should be good stewards of that. Well, continuing on in Genesis 1, we learn about God making the great lights, the sun to rule the day and the moon to rule the night. And then he made the stars. And so we're going to think about the sun and the moon for a little bit. And in particular, we're going to think about this verb here, mashal, which is translated to rule. I think one of the greatest things that has ever been invented is a concordance. And my first serious concordance was a Young's Analytical Concordance. And to this day, besides the Bible itself, that's probably my favorite book. But when you take that, or of course nowadays you can go online and use Bible Gateway, or you can use Blue Letter Bible, or there's many other resources that can be used to do a concordance study, to do a word study. But if you were to do one of this verb mashal, which is translated rule, because you might think, that does seem a little odd that the sun rules the day and the moon rules the night. I mean, is that kind of like colorful language? I mean, do you take that literally? Well, if you look at mashal in a concordance, you will find that almost all the time that verb is ever used, and it's used many times in the Old Testament, it's referring to either God ruling humans or humans ruling humans. But it's talking about someone who has a mind, and someone who has a personality, and who can personally relate to people, and they're ruling. So it does seem odd that the sun would be said to rule, or the moon would be said to rule our earth. And yet, very literally, that is the case. Because, as we will see very soon, what is the whole idea behind ruling? When we think about what that is, we'll see that both the sun and the moon do that. But before we get to that, do want to mention Psalm 8, and how we are again reminded of the hugeness of the heavens. And yet, even though that is the case, and how we're much smaller than the physical universe. In my case, I'm 5'12". Okay, some of y'all are thinking about that. But that's very small compared to the rest of the universe. And yet, God has chosen to give us the ability to appreciate this enormous creation He's made, and is using that experience as an opportunity for us to appreciate Him as our Creator. So, we think about also how huge the universe is, and one of the things that many people have tried to puzzle on is, how did starlight coming from stars that are so far away that in a lifetime their light won't get to us, how could we even see them if the universe is as young as the Bible says it is? If the universe is between 6.1 and 6.2 thousand years old, then how is it that we're able to see light from stars that are so far out there that their light, even if it started yesterday, it's not going to get here during our lifetimes? Anyway, the quick answer to that is that if you look at Genesis 1, it says, well, the most basic answer to that is, what God does in creation week, so the 6 days in which He's working, then He rests the seventh. What He's doing during His first 6 days, it's all miraculous. And so none of what's going on in those 6 days is going to match the way things operate today, because that's all miraculous. And yet light travels at a certain speed today, and yet it had to travel much faster than that on day 4 in order to get from the stars where He placed them to the earth, where He said He wanted that starlight to be seen for signs and seasons. And in other words, He wanted it to be seen by people on earth. And so He transmitted it very fast on day 4 at a speed that's much, much faster than starlight goes today. And the verb there is natan, which has the idea of to transfer or to transmit. So that's what God did with the light on day 4. He transferred it. And many times natan appears in the Old Testament in transactions where somebody is either giving something to somebody or selling something to somebody. And so natan is often translated as to buy or to sell or to give. And if the context is somebody's getting it for free, then the translator would translate it give. If somebody's receiving it in exchange for money, purchase money, then it may be translated buy or sell. But the literal meaning of that verb is to transfer. So if it's transfer for free, we say give. Transfer for money, we say sell or buy. But it's really a transfer that's going on. It's transition. Something is starting in one place and it's ending up in another place, whether it's starting with a person and ending with another person, or it's starting from on day 4's case, starting in a star and ending up on Earth. So it's a transfer of that light. All right, well, we dealt with the distant starlight problem. And now we go back to the sun, and it's declaring God's glory. It's documenting God's glory. The verb that is used there is a form of safar, which has the idea of documenting something, like a scribe, like an accountant, like somebody who keeps records, a journalist. And the heavens are actually declaring God's glory in a way that documents it with great detail. Well, the sun is part of the heavens, and the sun is continually documenting God's glory in great details. The sun has a circuit. It has a pattern. It has a pathway, and we'll look at more of that, a couple more verses that deal with that in a little bit. But Ecclesiastes 1:5 says that the sun rises and the sun goes down, and it hastes to the place where it arose. It has a very choreographed circuit that it has. Romans 1:20 indicates that the invisible things of Him, talking about God, from the creation of the world are clearly seen. So you don't have to try hard to see evidences of God's creatorship. You don't have to struggle to find the evidence. It's clearly seen. And in fact, God has given evidences of His creatorship in such clear-cut ways that if we ignore those or push them away, we do so without excuse. No one will have an excuse for saying, well, how was I supposed to know God created everything? That's not an excuse. The evidence is so strong that you have to be dishonest to not accept the evidence and appreciate what it's pointing to. Just curious, how many of you remember the solar eclipse on April 8th of this year? All right. That's a really amazing thing because the sun is 400 times bigger than the moon. But the moon is 400 times closer to us than the sun. And so in a way that kind of cancels out, and that way when the sun gets between, when the moon gets between us and the sun, you end up with a solar eclipse like what we saw. What an interesting coincidence that 400 is the factor in both directions so that we could see a solar eclipse. Wouldn't work any other way. Psalm 19 talks about how God has a circuit that the sun makes, and that as a result, nothing is deprived of its warmth. That is, all the warmth that we have on planet Earth, we would not have if we did not have the sun. So God gives to us because of that, and the sun makes a circuit. Is that controversial? Well, it was at one point in world history, and we'll come to that a little bit later. Oh, we're already there. And that controversy involved a guy named Galileo. Galileo asserted that the earth was moving and it went around the sun in a circle-like way, so that the sun was stationary and the earth was doing the moving. Galileo's opponents, who were the Inquisition team, that is the inquisitors of the Roman Catholic Church, they said, no, it's the opposite. The earth is stationary and the sun makes a circle around the earth. So it's the sun that's moving and the earth is stationary. Galileo said, no, it's the sun that's stationary, it's the earth that's moving. So they had their disagreement there, and Galileo ends up being punished, excommunicated, and then part of the penalty was softened a little bit. He had written in the Italian language about his scientific thoughts, and that was bothersome to the Roman Catholic Church because he was writing in the language of the people, his ideas. If he had maybe only written them in some other language, maybe they wouldn't have been as bothered by it. Of course, Kepler, being in Germany, he could write stuff like this all the time and not get any trouble because he was Lutheran. So here comes the trick question. I say it's a trick question. Wouldn't you know you get a trick question if the one asking the question is a lawyer? Anyway, so here's the trick question. Who is right and who is wrong? Roman Catholic Church or Galileo? All right, don't all yell out at once because it's hard to hear. They both were part right and they both were part wrong, because Galileo said the sun is stationary, the earth is in motion around it. The Roman Catholic Church said the earth is stationary, but the sun has a circuit that goes around it. Well, the earth has a circuit, and we'll see that in Isaiah 40:22. But the sun also has a circuit, and we see that in Psalm 19. So if both sides had been looking at their Bibles, they would have gotten it both right. That is, the earth is not motionless, but the sun is not motionless either. They both are in motion, and in fact, there are scriptures that talk about it. Another scripture that came into the discussion back then was Psalm 93:1. And Psalm 93:1 is translated like this: "The Lord reigns, he is clothed with majesty. The Lord is clothed with strength, wherewith he has girded himself. The world also is established, that it cannot be moved." Okay, so some of the inquisitors argued that Psalm 93:1 said the earth can't be moved, therefore it's motionless. Well, they didn't do very good in their Hebrew, because Psalm 93:1, when it says the earth can't be moved, what that means is it can't be yanked away. It can't be pulled off course from its programmed circuit of movements. So Psalm 93:1 is not talking about total lack of any motion. It's talking about it's not going to be yanked off course. In fact, there's a related Hebrew word to that verb that is translated yoke. When you're talking about two beasts of burden that have a yoke put on their neck when they plow a field, they're supposed to plow a field in a straight line. Now, they're not going to be yanked off course because the yoke helps keep them on course. And that's what God has done as the great engineer who controls the heavens, is he has made it so that the earth is not yanked off its course. It is just like animals can be yoked to keep their movements controlled. The earth is controlled by God so that it doesn't have erratic behavior. It stays on course. And that's what Psalm 93 is talking about, but neither Galileo nor the inquisitors were careful in their Hebrew, and so they misunderstood Psalm 93:1. So here is a set of the verses that you could look at to do further study on this. So the Hebrew word mot appears in context to portray a pulling away motion, yanking off course kind of a thing. So Proverbs 24:11, Psalm 82:5 uses the phrase out of course, Isaiah 54:10, and the word yoke appears in Leviticus 26:13 and Jeremiah 27:2. So that's a related word. So if you wanted to do this word study yourself, if you had a copy of George Wigram's The Englishman's Hebrew Concordance of the Old Testament, the Hendrickson 2001 reprint of the original, not the original, the third edition, originally published in 1874, it's on page 670. So you could do all of this study just by looking at that page, basically. And there's some other verses there. And a little bit later, we'll talk about Isaiah 40:22, how that is related to this as well. Okay, so now we're back to this question of how does the sun rule the day and how does the moon rule the night? And of course, we are to be thankful for what God has done by assigning these functions, these services to the sun and to the moon. And Psalm 136 tells us that we should thank God for the sun, the moon, and the stars. So how does the sun rule? Well, first of all, let's think about the idea of the word rule. Since 1996, I have served in a part-time capacity for the state of Texas as a trial judge. And one of the things that is a part of that situation, that context, is that suggestions are different from rules. Suggestions, you can do them or you can choose not to do them. But rules are different. Rules have enforcement behind them. And rules are imposed on someone or something, whether he, she, it, or they like it or not. And there's some kind of force that backs them up. That's why we call it enforceability or enforcement. So rules are not just suggestions. They have force behind them to enforce them. And the sun does that by providing sunlight. The sunlight that the sun provides rules a whole lot of what goes on in the daytime on planet Earth. The sunlight that comes from the sun, it is imposing behavioral limitations on what's on the planet. And so if you're in Texas and it's 110 degrees, you have to deal with the heat that is coming from the sun. And you can't just say, oh, that's a suggestion that I choose not to go along with. No, it's going to be 110 degrees whether you like it or not. And that's because the sun has been given that role by God to rule that part of the earth. That is, certain conditions on earth, the sun rules. And warmth is part of it, and also the intensity of how much light is out there. So if you say, well, I just choose not to I choose not to be impressed by the intensity of the sunlight today. So I'm going to just look up at the sun without sunglasses for a minute and just stare at the sun. Well, not a good idea. You'll ruin your eyes, because the sun is pouring out an intensity of sunlight whether you or I like it or not. And it is controlling certain things on earth during the day. And thankfully, the sunlight that the sun provides is actually very helpful. Earlier this year, I was in Saskatchewan, and so I made a couple slides to illustrate this. The official flower of the Saskatchewan province is the western red lily, but there would be no western red lilies if it wasn't for the sun providing sunlight that is used photosynthetically to produce the plant growth that happens there. And the same is true of trees. Their official tree is the paper birch. Well, there would be no paper birches if there was no sun to provide the sunlight that is used photosynthetically to produce and to grow the trees. Same thing with flowers, such as sunflowers. And interestingly, how many of you ever watched a sunflower tilt toward the sun? Yeah. So when the sun comes up in the east, if the sunflowers are here, their faces are toward the sun. And as the sun goes through its path, and at high noon when the sun is at the top of the sky, the sunflowers are looking directly up at the sun. And then as the sun goes into the west, the flowers tilt their little faces toward the sun. They basically follow the sun in order to get the sunlight that they use photosynthetically, and of course the warmth that comes with that. And they are just very complicated inventions that God has made. So let me read this real quick little piece about sunflowers. Inside the sunflower's generously seed-packed flower head are miniature florets that spiral concentrically as the sunflower blooms in a mathematical construction that progressively follows the Fibonacci sequence pattern, which I'll get to in a minute. This produces a happy-looking yellow flower that silently shouts God's handiwork and artistry. A sunflower can produce 1,000 to 2,000 seeds. And if you like to eat sunflower seeds, that's good. I do. The seeds in the middle of the flower head are arranged in a Fibonacci sequence. What is that? Well, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. If you take 1 and you add it to itself, you get 2. If you take the 1 and the 2 and you add them together, you get 3. If you take the 2 and the 3 and you add them together, you get the 5. You add the 3 and the 5 together and you get an 8. So that's how the sequence works. And that's exactly what happens in the flower, the sunflower. It follows the Fibonacci sequence because God designed it to do that. where each number is the sum of the two numbers that precede it. The sunflower is a composite flower that consists of two sets of florets. The yellow petal-like ring is made up of sterile ray florets. The brown center, depending on the species, can consist of thousands of brown seed-producing disc florets. Each produces one seed that is pollinated by insects, such as butterflies, or the wind. Should these fail, the flower will self-pollinate by twisting its stigma to reach its own pollen. Just amazing. Next time you look at a sunflower, I hope you remember some of that. They are truly amazing flowers. And we could talk more about them, but I had mentioned how they track the sun in their movement, and the fancy word for that is heliotropism, which just means it, follows, it's attracted to the sun. Young sunflower blossoms face east in the morning, then follow the sun by slowly arching westward as the earth rotates throughout the day. This behavior, called heliotropism, even takes place on cloudy days and will continue until the stem stiffens to bear the heavy load of growing seeds. Mature flower heads often face east, and these plants can attract 5 times as many pollinators as westward facing ones because they warm up more quickly. Because the little pollinators, let's say it's a bee, bees need to get their warmth from whatever's right near them, that is their immediate environment. They're not warm-blooded like we are. Our bodies are designed to maintain a somewhat consistent body temperature. But a little creature like a bee has to get its warmth from the immediate environment around it. And so they are attracted to plants that are warmer. And so the bees are helping the flowers, and the flowers are helping the bees. And that's the main point of this slide as well. Well, there's a consistency to this. And the seasons are needed to be dependable by bees, by flowers, by us. And we see in Genesis 8:22 that God made a promise after the flood: while earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. There will be dependable cycles in the year as well as in the daily cycle, and God has instituted that and controls it. So that's part of how the sun is not only serving the created things on earth, but also is ruling the created things on earth by imposing conditions of warmth and light that we must live with, whether we like it or not. By controlling sunlight needed by plants, the sun is indirectly controlling the animals who are depending on the plants for the life. So the grasshopper is going to be eating plants. And so if the plants are controlled by the sun, then the living activities of the grasshopper are necessarily directly dependent on that as well. And then, of course, just the very production of carbohydrates in a plant, that is only possible when it's facilitated by the presence of sunlight that the chlorophyll can harness and use that to convert carbon dioxide and water into different kinds of carbohydrates plus molecular oxygen that we need to breathe. And that means that by powering photosynthesis, God is using the sun to control the food chain, or you could call it the food pyramid, and it's really a food web. It's so complicated. But none of that would work if it wasn't for how the sun is ruling the day, providing warmth and providing sunlight, which is used by plants for all of the food chain. And also producing breathable oxygen. So without that, we don't get any oxygen. And then, of course, without the carbon dioxide, the plants don't get what they need. Now, it's all very, very complicated, but it's also very good at illustrating how God has provided for us humans, for animals, and for plants, and is using the sun to do that in a way that's not suggested, but it's actually ruled. And then, of course, the heat. You can't stop the sun's heat. You might move from one part of the planet to the other, like hibernating, or excuse me, like migrating. But yeah, you could hibernate too. But the sun is set up to have a circuit, and that results in patterns of heat so that some places get more heat than others based on what the circuit is that God has given to the sun. But what about the moon? How does the moon rule? Well, as it turns out, the moon's orbit around the earth and the way that it is all mathematically designed to operate results in the moon controlling a lot of what happens on the earth because of its gravitational pull. And one of the most obvious illustration of that is the tides. We have ocean tides all over the world. And we would not have those ocean tides if we did not have the orbit of the moon and the different phases of the moon that are the details of that orbit. So in that respect, the moon is ruling the earth. It is imposing conditions on the earth, physical conditions that we just have to live with whether we like it or not. If it's high tide, you can't stop it from being high tide. It's going to be high tide. And when it's low tide, the same thing is there. The moon is doing that. And the way that I have of appreciating this, because one of my original questions was, why would you use the word rule if the sun doesn't have a personality? If the moon doesn't have a personality? And yet kings and God and humans, they rule all the time and they have personalities, but the sun doesn't, the moon doesn't. Well, what about a Canada Dry truck from Silver Spring, Maryland? How many of you have ridden on 495 in the last year or so? The interstate up there. Okay. It's a safer place there now than it used to be because I'm not driving a Canada Dry truck there anymore. But there was a time when I was, one of the many jobs that eventually I got through college somehow. But one of the things that I remember about those trucks is that they had a governor on the engine. And that meant that no matter how hard you pressed the accelerator with your foot, it wasn't going to go 80, it wasn't going to go 70, it wasn't going to, I don't even think it could go 60. I think it topped out at is either 50 or 55 was the way they would set that governor. Now the governor was ruling the engine. And yet the governor in that truck was not a personality. It was a thing. It was a non-living thing, a mechanical thing, which had been designed by an intelligent, living personality. So the engineers who invented the governors that are put on truck engines to be speed limiting devices, the smart engineers created the non-living governor which ruled the engine and put physical limits on what it could do. And so in that respect, God, who is infinitely intelligent, invented these two governors that are in space, one called the moon and one called the sun. And those governors, although they are not animate, they're not personalities, they have been designed by someone who is intelligent and who gave them the ability to rule what happens during the day when it comes to light or warmth, or what happens at nighttime when the gravitational pull is changing things on Earth and producing the ocean tides, which we very much need. So without the ocean tides, things go bad fast. Thankfully, it doesn't happen. But if we didn't have ocean tides, the water would get polluted and stagnant really fast, and so many living things that are in the ocean would die. And also the phytoplankton that are in the ocean would die, and the phytoplankton actually produces a large percentage of the oxygen we breathe. So, a lot of the oxygen we breathe comes from photosynthesis of land-based plants, but also we have these floating plants that are in the ocean that are microscopic, and yet they're producing a lot of oxygen that we need. So, the moon's behaviors are like a truck's speed limiting governor, invented by God to impose limiting conditions, physical conditions on Earth. So who benefits from the ocean tides? Well, for one thing, oysters do, because an oyster is an animal. But unlike many animals that roam around trying to find food, when an oyster attaches to something, it's kind of stuck after that. And so that means either the oyster is going to die really fast, or food is going to have to come to the oyster. And so if the tides are moving water in and out, in and out, in and out, and it's sloshing all this water around that has different nutrients in it that oysters can eat, then instead of it being meals on wheels, it's meals on waves that are coming in, and the oysters as filter feeders can get the nutrients they get from that they need from the water that comes sloshing in and out, and then they can squirt out the water that they don't need, but they got the food they needed. And oysters are a whole other thing. And of course, mussels be the same thing. So, it's very similar. They help clean up the water. They're very helpful in a lot of ways. And if you happen to like to eat oysters, they're tasty too, and they're a good source of zinc. But they're a very important part of the nitrogen cycle. But none of that would work with oysters if it wasn't for the moon providing a pattern of repeating gravitational pulls of a very strong pull or not so strong pull. You wouldn't have that without the tides if it wasn't for the moon ruling the night in a physical way. In fact, even crabs depend on the lunar cycles for reproduction, because God has designed them with a software program that says when it's the high tide at a certain time in the lunar cycle, that's when you go down to the beach, you reproduce, and then the moms go down to the edge of the water and they release their fertilized eggs into the ocean water. And then those little fertilized eggs go out in the ocean water, they hatch, they swim around as little baby crabs. And then eventually when it's the right lunar cycle and the tides are right, they wash into the land and it starts all over. So we'll see just a quick example of that. These are Christmas Island red crabs. And once a year, the adults go to the seashore to start the next generation of red crabs. And they just head to the shore. And if there's a golf course in the way, that's okay to just go across the golf course. If there's a roadway, well, hopefully there's a protective fence to keep them from getting on the road. Otherwise, a lot of them get cracked and flat tires happen. So they rely on the cycles of the moon to know when to go to the shore to reproduce. And then, like I say, the next generation gets plopped into the tide waters, gets washed out to sea for, I forget how many days. And then they get washed back onto land when they're little bitty crabs. And then they go crawling into inland, live in the forest for a while until they're old enough to be the next parenting generation. So as you can see, that's a lot of red crabs, even to the point where they have to close some of the roads to facilitate the migration. And you see a little kid there with a whole bunch of crabs that are headed toward the sea. And the red crab mothers release their fertilized eggs into the sea at the turn of the strongest high tide, which is based on the moon's phases. These hatch on contact with seawater, and then as larvae, they live at sea for about 4 weeks. Okay, that's longer than I thought. So about 4 weeks. That's about a month. And then they return, they get washed back up on the beaches, and they crawl inland to the forests as baby land crabs. So let me see if I can give you a little moving picture of that. And you probably can't hear any sound from this. But these are your Christmas Island red crabs. And they are located, if you see that little yellow spot, on an island called Christmas Island, and it's on the west side of Australia, which means it's in the body of water that has Australia on the east and Africa on the west. So some of these crabs, they go across the bridge so they don't get hit on the highway. And they are determined, 40 million of them, to make it to the seashore when it's that time of year. And I'm not sure how much money Olin Mills makes off them, because they're not the most photogenic faces that you'll ever see, but they sure are amazing. And how is it that a creature that's only this big has an understanding, in whatever kind of a brain they have, to know, oh, it's the lunar cycle. Oh, that affects the high tide. Oh, this is the right time of year to go down to the seashore to start the next generation and give them the best statistical advantage of survival. No, God had to design that so that they would know to do that. So pretty amazing. Let's see. And of course, they should avoid train tracks. That's just not good. Job 12:8 says, "Speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto you." And that is a form of the verb safar, which I mentioned earlier, has the idea of documenting something, writing down the details, making a record of it. So the participle form of that verb, sofer, is translated scribe, and a noun based on that verb, sefer, is translated book. So anything that records detailed information, we'd call that a book. And a human who records detailed information, we might call that person a scribe or a reporter. But that's what the fish are doing. They are declaring in great detail to us information about God's actions and displaying his intelligence in his creation. Well, what about salmon? I love to eat salmon. What would you think of the little salmon paying attention to the phases of the moon, because their lives depend on it, at least somewhat? Well, if you think about the life cycle of the salmon, and in this case the Pacific salmon, we'll keep it simple. The Pacific salmon, they start in the freshwater stream. They eventually swim down to the coast, and they go from freshwater into the saltwater of the ocean. They live in the ocean for a while, and then they come back to the streams where they started to reproduce, and then they die. Okay, that's Pacific salmon oversimplified. Whereas your Atlantic salmon, they can reproduce and then go back out to sea again, and then come back in and reproduce again. So their life cycle is a little more complicated, because they don't just die at the first reproduction. But anyway, if you look at this chart here showing the life cycle of the Pacific salmon, you will see that they, if you look at 6 o'clock, you see them as fertilized eggs, and then the eggs hatch as you get to about 7 o'clock. Then when you get to about 9 o'clock, they're fry, and then about 10 o'clock, they're called par, and this is when they're going to migrate to sea. And then once they migrate to sea, well, by the time you get to 1 o'clock, they're at ocean salmon. But the pivotal time when they are going to transfer from freshwater to saltwater, that is a time when they will go downstream, and they will do it at night, because there are a lot of creatures out there that live near the streams and sometimes frequent the streams, and they love to eat fish, right? I'm curious, how many of you love to eat fish? I do. Right? My record is 70 consecutive meals that had fish. Okay, did it on a cruise ship once. That was wonderful. But anyway, there are a lot of creatures out there that like to eat fish. It could be a river otter, or it could be, there's a lot of things. And so these little fish, when they're getting ready to go downstream, the best time to do it is a very dark night. Well, the phases of the moon are full moon, and then there's part of the moon, and then that little sliver looks like a fingernail clipping, and then there's when you can't see the moon at all. And that's when they choose to go downstream, is when there is no moonlight at all. And that could happen if it's just real cloudy. But they are designed with little photosensors in their body to where they can tell how much light there is out there. And so when their sensors tell them it's dark, there is no light at all, then there is a logic that is designed into them by God that informs them this is the time. This is the time to go downstream. And they all go down together. And that way, even if there is some carnivore that happens to be in this water, at least, a few of them might get eaten, but all the rest of them are going to safely make it downstream. So when they become smolt, that is, once they start getting these little bars on them, and then the bars start to go away and they become silvery, that transition from bar to smolt, that will happen. And in the springtime, and of course in many of the places where they are, the snow is melting, so you have a lot of water. The water is washing downstream. Sometimes that extra amount of water is loosening a lot of the soil, and so it's a cloudier water. It's harder to see what's in there, and that also adds to the camouflage as they swim downstream, because they only got one chance. And so when the moon is not even seen at all, that's the night when they go, and they swim downstream, and there you go. The Bible talks about fish a lot. In fact, the Bible even talks about fish in a way that touches on romance. Okay, maybe you didn't think of this, but in the Song of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 4, Solomon is talking to his sweetheart, and he says, "Your neck is as a tower of ivory, your eyes like the fish pools in Heshbon by the gate of Batrabim." Now, I'm not sure what's so romantic about someone's eyes looking like pools of fish in Heshbon. So I guess that's just one that I missed. But anyway, have any of you ever been told that your eyes look like fish pools? No, okay. I just wondered. But anyway, fish have been around a long time. Fish are designed to recognize what's going on in terms of light versus darkness around them. And here's an illustration of that from the world of aquaculture, in particular fish farming of salmon off the coast of Norway. So there was a fellow named Kenneth Brandel who was working for the company that then was called Marine Harvest Norway, which is a big global leader in salmon farming. And as you can see from the bottom picture, those net pens it's like a boardwalk that connects them all, and then you have these floating nets that are contained, and the fish are in there. So they're living in coastal waters that are very similar to the natural conditions, and yet they can't swim away because there's a net keeping them in. And so they're fed fish food from time to time, and they grow and they eat and they grow and they eat. And then when it looks like their bodies are just about right and it's starting to be time for them to reproduce, which means their eating system kind of scales down and other parts of their bodies get more active. And at that time, that's the time to sell the salmon, because once it gets into full reproductive mode, the meat's not as good. It's not going to sell. You're not going to make as much money selling it. So what they try to do is get them to grow as much as they can, as fast as they can, and then just before they go into reproductive mode, sell them on the market. And of course, they're sold by the pound. That's how much they make their money. Well, as it turned out, some of these boardwalks have had accidents where workers who were there doing something at nighttime, and of course in Norway, nighttime during the winter is many hours. It's a lot more than 12 hours a day. So they have the land of the midnight sun in the summer, but of course the opposite in winter. And so a dark place, if you're by yourself and you fall into the water, you could drown. So as a safety measure to help the workers, they instituted artificial lighting so that the workers could see where they were walking and not fall in and drown. Well, the artificial lighting confused the fish. The fish, seeing all this light, think, oh, it's still summer. And so instead of the summer days getting shorter as you head into autumn, this artificial lighting made it look like it was always summer, never stopped being summer. And so the fish whose bodies are designed to do certain things based on how much hours of light there is in a 24-hour cycle, they just keep growing. They just keep growing. They don't go into reproductive mode. And so it kind of confused their body systems. And of course, it confused it in a way that made more money for the companies that are raising fish. Because if the fish keep growing, getting bigger, they weigh more, they sell for more, they make more money. Anyway, as a result, Kenneth Brandel got a great big promotion with the company, and they were very happy for him to have made that discovery. Well, now we move on to talking about the circuits of the heavens. And Job 22 mentions that, is not God in the height of heaven? And behold, the height of the stars, how high they are. He, referring to God, travels in the circuit of heaven. What is heaven's circuit? The Hebrew word here is hug. Very interesting word, hug. Well, the same word hug appears in, let's see if I have it here, Isaiah 40, verse 22, where it says, and it is he who dwells above the circle of the earth. King James translates it, the circle of the earth. And the word circle there is hug. And the inhabitants thereof are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens as a curtain. He spreads them out as a tent to dwell in. And of course, some have looked at that phrase, he stretches out the heavens like a curtain, and they go, oh, this is like the Big Bang. This is like, the expanding universe. It's stretched out. No, it's not. It's not at all. Because you don't stretch out a curtain forever and ever and ever and ever. You'd rip up the curtain. Or when you're spreading out a tent, that is when you collapse a tent, you move somewhere else for this green stuff for your flocks to eat. Then you find a valley where there's a lot of green stuff for your flocks to eat because they already ate up all the green stuff in the other valley. You think, oh, this is a good place. I'll put down my tent here. So you take your poles and you take your fabric and you stretch it out, but you don't keep stretching and stretching and stretching and stretching. You bust up your tent material. Okay, you just spread it out until it's in the right position and it's got the right framework, and then you set it up. This same word for stretch out is used of Moses when he was taking his staff and stretching out his arm, because God was going to do something when he stretched out his arm with the staff in it. Well, his arm wasn't infinitely elastic like a rubber band that goes to the Andromeda galaxy. Once he had stretched his arm out as far as it's supposed to go, it stopped. Okay, it's the same thing here in Isaiah 40. So the way that God stretched out the heavens is the way that you would stretch out a curtain, or the way that you would stretch out tent material when you're reconstructing your tent, having moved from one place to another. Okay, so just wanted to touch on that, because some people would suggest that the stretching out of the heavens is consistent with the Big Bang expanding universe. It expands forever and ever and ever and ever. And no, that's not what that's saying. All right, so now we're going to go back to the word hug, which is translated circle in Isaiah 40:22. Is that referring to the earth being round, or is that referring to the earth going around? That's the question. Okay, and in order to answer that question, if you were to do a concordance study on the word hug, as well as on the verb that it's based on, its root verb is hagag, and then there are some other related words that are also derived from the verb hagag. And one of the things that you'll find if you were to do that concordance study is that the word feast many times translates one of those words, hag, which is a noun derived from hagag. So these are all related words. So if we were to look in Leviticus, we would read from chapter 23 the following. Also in the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall celebrate. Now here is a form of the verb hagag. What is it you're to celebrate? A feast. Wow. Now here's a noun derived from the verb Hagag. And the feast of the Lord 7 days. And on the first day shall be a Sabbath, and on the 8th day shall be a Sabbath. You shall celebrate, again, another verb derived from Hagag. A feast. Here, another noun derived from the same root verb. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate, again, a verb derived from Hagag. And so one of the things you see is that this word hug is connected to words that have the idea of celebrating a feast. How do you get circle of the earth connected to a Levitical feast and celebrating feast? What do those two have in common? Okay, here's what I think it answers the question. In 1 Samuel 30:16, we read the following. One of the adventures in the life of King David. And when he, and it's talking about an Egyptian, brought him, now it's talking about David, down, behold, they, the they is Amalekites, were spread abroad upon all the earth, eating and drinking and dancing, because all of the great spoil that they took from the Philistines' land and from Judah's land. So we have a bunch of Amalekites who are celebrating. All right, celebrate. Remember celebrate? And they're celebrating because they got a bunch of stuff from their military activities. And the word that is used for them dancing is hogagim, which is a active participle that is translated dancing. And then it all made sense. It's like, okay, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when they are celebrating, when they're having a feast, when they're dancing, is this whole idea of celebrating in an orderly way. And that is what the heavens are doing. They are celebrating in an orderly way, like a dance. God has designed the heavenly bodies so that they are in this very choreographed dance that celebrates the glory that God has given them. The one who sits above the circle of the earth, that circle is like a very choreographed dance. Now, many years ago, Sherry remembers this, I tried out for a dance organization, a dance group. It was traditional Norwegian dancing, which is very different than the kind of dancing that was done when I was in junior high. When I was in junior high, it was not choreographed. It was chaotic. It was just, hey, just, throw your body parts around. Kick and swing. And Norwegian folk dancing is very different. It's very organized. In some of the dances, certain guys will have a sword and they'll swing it, and the people who are dancing in this direction are supposed to know to duck their head at just the right moment based on the music that they're hearing. If you memorize the music, you're supposed to know what the dance steps are. But if you get it wrong, you get hit in the head by a sword. That's not good. Anyway, some people are really good at memorizing things like that. I'm not one of them. And so after a couple of practices, I was told, hey, Jim, why don't you stand on the side with a camera and just take pictures of us? And that way, nobody gets hurt. Because the way that those dances went, everybody's going in a certain circle, and then when the music did something different, everybody knows to stop and turn around and go in the opposite direction. I'm still going in the wrong direction, and I'm smacking into people, knocking them down. So I'm not one to be one of those dancers. And you don't want the comets and the planets and the stars and the moons behaving out there the way that I would dance if I was trying to do a dance. So they need to be very choreographed. So just to give you an appreciation for how it needs to be orderly so people don't knock each other down. Okay, this is the way it's supposed to be done. You see, look at this. Nobody's getting knocked to the ground. Nobody's getting kicked. I don't see anybody bleeding. This is all working out. It's all very mathematical. And that's the way that God has designed the heavens to operate. The sun does exactly what it's supposed to do. If it did it a little bit wrong, we would burn up. It gets bad enough when it's 110 in Texas in the summer. But it could be worse. What if it was 160? the sun has certain limitations to how it operates, how it moves. Same thing with the moon, same thing with the earth, and same thing with the planets and everything. Well, some, because the heavenly bodies are so amazing in their movement, have been so awed by that, that instead of thanking God for making these amazing things in the heavens that have such mathematical precision that they can be predicted out and relied upon, and people at sea for many generations would look at the night sky and figure out where they were going on the ocean and get there safely because they were guided by the stars. Well, we should be thanking God for making the heavens so predictable and orderly. But many, because we are a fallen race, have, instead of thanking God for making the heavens, they have worshiped the heavens. And so instead of blessing the blesser and thanking him for the blessings, they have worshiped the blessings themselves. And so they worship the sun and they worship the moon. And in modern times, we've gotten even to the silliness beyond ridiculousness stage, to where in the attempt to not worship God, and therefore to think of the universe as self-made out of nothing. How do you do that? And then trying to apply that to the world of physics, and the math doesn't work out. And so what do you do when the math doesn't work out, when you're trying to describe the universe, but you're trying to do it in a way that assumes evolution? When the math doesn't work out, they just add stuff there and say, well, I guess 23% of what's going on out there we can't see. There's no evidence that it exists. But mathematically it has to exist, because otherwise our theories are wrong, and that can't be true. So because our theories can't be wrong, but because what we observe doesn't match our theories, we're just going to assume that 23% of what's out there we have no ability to see. We'll call it dark matter. And then when that didn't solve all the problems, then they had to come up with this idea of dark energy, which can't be seen and therefore can't be proved. But we need it for our math equations to work out, because otherwise our theories fail. And so they explain the reality of what goes on in the universe as 23% dark matter that can't be seen, can't be measured, and 73% dark energy that can't be seen, can't be measured. And what we see out there that actually matches real science is less than 4%. And they won't give up their theory. And so they'll just invent stuff that it's just, it's imagination. Anyway. Well, God created the heavens, and so he owns them, and they glorify him. And there's lots of verses in the Old Testament that talk about that. And whereas the Big Bang, it's just, as 1 Timothy 6:20 would say, science falsely so called. Or as Paul said, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served things rather than the Creator, who is forever blessed. The real purpose for the lights in the heavens was to divide the day from the night, and to be for signs and seasons, and for days and years, and to be for lights in the firmament of the heavens, to give light on the earth. And then, of course, as we read in the other passage, for the sun specifically to rule the day, and the moon to rule the night. And there's a whole lot of them out there. Now, he measures the number of the stars. He calls them all by name. Well, that's a really interesting verse, because the word for measure, mana, has the idea of it continues. He's continuing to measure not just how many stars are out there, but all of their quantifiable characteristics. That is, what their temperature is, what the radius is from the center of the star to the outside. So the size of the star, the temperature of the star, the color of the star, the speed of the star in motion, anything that could be quantified with a number. God automatically knows all of that, and he is in real time recognizing the detailed measurement of every one of those. And he even has names for all of them. And yet there are more stars than our human minds can comprehend. If we were to count all the stars, and Jeremiah says the host of heaven cannot be numbered, specifically the verb he uses is a form of safar. So the idea is you can't itemize in detail. We humans do not have the ability to record in itemized detail the host of the heavens. It's just too far for our brains. And same would be true of the details of the sand of the sea. Well, God said he will multiply the seed of David, and he also knows all of that information himself. So the current estimates are that there are 100 to 200 billion galaxies, and that each of those galaxies has about 100 billion stars. That's just the current estimate. Now, my guess is that as technology increases and they can see more of what's out there, that number will go up, not down. But just with what they think is out there now, based on the technology we have today, that's 10 to the 22nd stars. So if you look at that long number with all the zeros, and you start on the right side of that, and then you go toward the left, the first comma, that takes you to the thousands. The next comma takes you to million, and then billion, and then trillion, and then quadrillion, and then quintillion, and then septillion. So 10 septillion stars. If you were to name all the stars, and they'd have to have long names, unless you were going to repeat names. But if you did one a second, that would take 300 trillion years. And of course, God knows all that in an instant. All right, we are moving on in the book of Genesis, and here's one that is particularly good. And probably after this one, we should take a 5-minute break, maybe. This is an very interesting verse. Genesis 2:24. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and he shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Now the interesting thing here is, it doesn't say shall become one flesh. It says be one flesh. And this is that same verb for to be, haya. And so the idea here is that the married couple are so much of a unit that when you think of the man and the woman, and you think of them, of course they have two personalities living inside two different physical bodies, and yet they are so much one unit that when one of them thinks of them, automatically both bodies are thought of. And I don't know if I should give an illustration on that or not. Okay, I'm going to give it. All right. What really helped me to appreciate this verse was Sherry had a knee problem. And we'll skip the details of how the knee injury happened, but a total knee replacement is not a lighthearted matter. It is a serious matter. And so when a total knee replacement surgery happens, it's not just the surgery, but then there's what happens after the surgery. There's the therapy, and there's the keeping the foot elevated. The helpful phrase is toes above your nose. So when you're recovering from a total knee surgery, what you don't want is blood clots. What you don't want is infection in the knee. You don't want the blood to do anything wrong. You want the blood to keep doing whatever it's supposed to do. And one of the things to do to prevent a blood clot is if you're spending a whole lot of time with your toes up, and if your head is here and your toes are here, if your toes are higher than your nose, that's a good thing. Doesn't mean you can't ever walk around the room, but it means that most of the time during the day, it would be good if your feet are elevated. That will help you to recover from a total knee replacement. Okay, and then also it is important to make sure that the blood is circulating. And so one thing you can do is you can kind of massage the leg and the knee and around there to make sure that blood is moving and stuff like that. It encourages the blood to do what God has designed blood to do, which is amazing when you think of how you recover from injuries and stuff and all the things that go on in the blood system. Okay, so at one point, it was time for me. It must have been in the end of the month because I was going to take a shower. You take a shower at the end of the month. Okay, I'm just checking to see if y'all are listening. All right. So it was time for me to take, it was a day when I was taking a shower. And so I'm in the shower and I'm soaping up and I'm soaping different parts. And then without thinking, I touched my right knee. And I went, oh, no, don't. Oh, that's right. That's her knee. You see, we've been married for more than 47 years. And we're very much a unit. And so when I get used to thinking that right knee is one that you don't touch much, and then I'm in the shower and I touch my own knee at that point, and my instant thought was, don't do it. Oh, no, that's okay. It's her knee that you can't do that to. My knee, it's okay. Go ahead and soap it. It's fine. Well, anyway, when I thought of that and I thought of this verse here, I thought, yeah, we are one flesh. We have been ongoing together as one unit for so long that when I think of right knee, I think of my knee, but I also think of her knee. It's anyway. If that helps you to have a better appreciation for the verb to be in Genesis 2:24, great. And if it doesn't, well, then don't worry about it. You'll have to find your own illustration. Okay. And we'll probably break on this one. Genesis 3:15. Jerome translated, or some say he translated a translation of, but anyway, Jerome was responsible for a Latin translation called the Vulgate. And that was treated as the authoritative Bible in much of Europe for centuries. But one thing he did do was a bad translation of Genesis 3:15. And so if you look at this verse, it says, and there will be enmity between you and between the woman. Okay, the woman there is in the red on the first line. And between your seed, and between seed of you, and between seed of her. That is her seed, the woman. So it's the seed of the woman. All right, this is the first reference to Christ. He is called the seed of the woman in Genesis 3:15. So that's right here. Seed of her. All right, the woman. Now this pronoun right here is a masculine pronoun. So it should be translated he. And he will strike to head. He will strike you to head, and you will strike him to the heel or the foot area. Okay? So in other words, God is talking to Satan, and he says to Satan, he, and the he is the seed of the woman. The seed of the woman is a masculine. It's a he. It's Jesus. So he will strike you, Satan, to the head, and you will strike him to the ankle or the foot area. So who's going to do the striking of the serpent? It's going to be the seed of the woman, who is a he. It's Christ. Jerome translated this, and there's no excuse for it, as she, because he wanted to promote a role for Mary that the Bible didn't have. So he that has caused a lot of trouble. Jerome was responsible for 3 different kinds of trouble, but anyway, that was one of them. So one of the things that we need to be very careful about when we translate the Bible is that we don't add to the word, subtract from the word, or change something that's in the word. If it is a masculine, leave it a masculine. Anyway, we're going to have another confusing verse on that later, which deals with an eagle's wings. There's a passage in Deuteronomy 32 that talks about comparing God's taking care of Israel to something about eagle's wings. We'll get to that later, but that was another example of somebody not being careful with their feminines and masculines. Of course, that's translation. Nowadays in our world and in our nation, we have people having difficulty recognizing the difference between masculine and feminine. It's a pretty sad situation. Well, let's take a 5-minute comfort break, and then when we come back, we'll resume a few more of these word studies.